Let's talk about various properties that affect how things lay themselves out. There's a lot of properties that control how things display on the screen. At the moment I'm using a tool called XAMLpad, which comes from WPF, but it allows us just to play with some XAML like we can use in Silverlight and display it very quickly. So here what we've got is a page with a grid on it, and let's start off by just putting a rectangle into this grid, and let's say fill equals red. And immediately we get a big rectangle that's taking all of the space that's available on the screen, which is quite interesting. Why is it doing that? Well, it's essentially stretching itself to fill that space. We can control whether this rectangle stretches itself to fill this space or not by setting a property that we call horizontal alignment. Now we have a choice here. We can say center. Now notice that the rectangle disappears when we say center. Why is that? Well, essentially what we're saying is that we want the content centered in the middle of the grid. Now there is no width specified for this content, so how can we work out where the center position is? Well, we can't. So unless you specify a width, which might say 20 or something like that, then it's not going to display anything. So alignment of center or alignment of left or alignment of right really depends on having a width or a height. And obviously we can also say vertical alignment. Let's say it once again is top. Then at this point the content will disappear again because we don't have a height. Let's say a height of 20 and make a square, and then we can see we're now in the top right. Let's bring that back into the center, and let's bring that back into the bottom, and let's also take it to the center. So horizontal alignment and vertical alignment, whether they be center, width and height, are very important. And the other one, which was what we were defaulting to, was stretch, and we changed that to stretch. Notice that nothing's happening because we specified width and heights. We can get rid of that width and it will stretch. We can get rid of that height and it will now stretch. Now there are situations where you want to be quite sort of dynamic. You may not want to stretch as such, but you might want to be able to not specify actual widths. So we can go back to our centering example for a minute. Let's say center and center. We get nothing at this point. Now without specifying width and height, I can specify a min width, let's say of 96, and a min height of 96. I could also specify a max width, let's say of I don't know, 192, and a max height of 192. And this means that if we have some kind of dynamic layout, this content will size as the containing grid sizes, but it will only size within these regions. So I haven't given it a specific width and height, but I've set some boundaries around how it can scale, so minimum and maximum also creeps into this picture. There are other things that relate to sizing, so let's go back to stretching this rectangle to fill all of its space. So there it is, back filling its space. We have properties called margins. A margin is how much space the control puts around itself before drawing itself. So we could say a margin of 96, which is an inch, and you can see there's an inch of screen space around the edge of that thing. Or we can specify specific margins, so we can say left, let's go for 10. We can say top, which could be 20. We can say right, which could be 30, and we can say bottom, which should be 40, let's say. And we're setting specific margins for the left, the top, the right, and the bottom of this rectangle, so you can specify margins that way. Now let's take our rectangle and move him from the grid and put him into something like a button. So we'll have a button here, and we'll put our rectangle in there, and interestingly he disappears straight away. So there's a couple of things about this. Let's take the margin away for a second. Forget the margin. Let's give our rectangle a width of 96 and a height of 96, and he pops up again, so that's interesting. And let's go and look at the button, and let's say horizontal content alignment equals stretch, and let's say vertical content alignment equals stretch. So now you can see what's happening is the button is deciding how to stretch this rectangle, how to lay it out. The grid was doing this kind of automatically for us. The button needs to be told in this case how to do this with its content. Of course we can use center again, and if we use center then we'd have to set a width, let's say of 10, and we'll see that thing pop up if we have a width on that. We'll just go back to where we were a second ago. Now when we're laying this out like this, the button is controlling how this rectangle is filling this space. And where we can still set margins on this button, so we can say margin equals 20, that's fine. But if you're a content control like this button is, you might want to specify sort of the margin, if you like, yourself. You might want to dictate how your inner content is positioned, and you can do that through a property called padding. So we can say padding equals 96, something like that, and you can see how that works. Or we say 10, 20, 30, 40 like we did before, and you can see how that works. So this is the parent specifying how the child is laid out. Of course the child can then have some more margin if they want to. Let's add another 20 there and it'll get smaller still. That's up to that. So padding controls things, horizontal alignment, vertical alignment, and then margin as well controls how things are laid out. Now when it comes to grids, at the moment our grid has one implicit row and column in it, so we can make that explicit by saying grid.row definitions, and let's just copy that and paste it in. And we can also have grid.column definitions, so let me just put some column definitions in there as well. And grid's really useful because it has proportional layout, and we can take this and say we'll have a row definition, and we can say on this one, let's say height equals star. That means to be as big as you can be. And we can have this column definition which says width equals star, and that's be as big as you can be. And then within our margins and so on, we get our rectangle positioned the way we want. And in fact, let's lose the button at this point and go back to just having a simple rectangle that's now filling all of that space. Now where things get interesting, let's just put a margin once again around our button. Let's say the margin of 10, something like that, around our rectangle rather. And let's make the background of this grid something obvious like green. Let's make that green. And what's interesting about this is at the moment the grid has a size, and the grid is really stretching itself out to fill the page. But what if we were to say something like the grid horizontal alignment equals center, and if we were to say the grid vertical alignment equals center, and the grid is now essentially sizing itself around this margin here, because if we have no margin there, what's happening is we're saying that the grid could be as big as it wants to be, but there's nothing in the grid that actually has any specific size. Consequently the grid disappears. If we were to make this rectangle, let's say width equals 96, height equals 96, then you can see how the grid is kind of working out what its size should be. If we were to set a minimum width on the grid of, let's say, 124 and a minimum height of 124, then the grid now has something to base itself on. So you have to always kind of remember that when you're looking down these control hierarchies, there's a combination of different ways in which you can size things, and they come together cumulatively to determine how big something should be. We can also say something like the height of a grid row is set to the height of the content, auto height sizing. So rather than filling the whole space, just work out how big your content is supposed to be and be that big. And once again, if we take away widths and heights now, this grid will be sized as nothing. Whereas if we say something like the minimum width of this rectangle is 96, then the grid, let's give it a height as well, the grid can now work out that it needs to be at least this big in order to contain this content, and so consequently it sizes itself that way. So bear in mind as well that with things like grids sizing themselves to their content means that somewhere in the hierarchy something has to say how big it actually wants to be.